We're unlocking the past and looking at the origin of 11 marriage customs that shaped our celebrations of love and commitment. Ever wondered about the origins of the best man? Or where the white wedding dress came from? How about the origin of divorce? We'll get into these traditions and much more. The best man. This origin story takes us back to the Germanic Goths. Here, a man would traditionally marry a woman from his own community. But what happens when women are scarce? He'd venture to a neighboring village and capture his bride-to-be. The would-be groom, supported by his best man, would seize a young lady who had ventured away from her home. This is the origin of our modern-day best man, a critical figure chosen for this high-stakes mission. This tradition of capturing brides also sparked the symbolic act of carrying the bride over the threshold. The best man's duties didn't end there. He stood armed and alert by the groom's side during the wedding, ready to prevent the bride's family from reclaiming her. Amazingly, the threat was so real that under many early church altars lay an arsenal of weapons. And ever wonder why the bride stands to the groom's left? That's because the groom needed his right hand, the sword hand, free for defense. The wedding ring. Let's journey back to 2800 BC, Egypt, where the first known wedding rings emerged. The circular shape of the rings, with no beginning or end, embodied eternity, reflecting the everlasting bond of marriage. There's debate though, with some suggesting the ring represents the chains once used to keep a bride to her captor's home. If that's true, modern double ring ceremonies at least symbolize a step towards gender equality where both people bind themselves to each other. The ancient Egyptians and later Romans favored gold for their wedding rings. Roman grooms often splurged on gold bands, causing one 2nd century AD priest to note that for many women, their only experience with gold was their wedding ring. Roman wives proudly wore these gold bands in public, switching to iron at home. Rings also carried messages. Some Roman bands had a mini key, symbolizing the bride's entitlement to half her husband's wealth under Roman law. A rather progressive notion that would take 2 millennia to resurface. The diamond engagement ring. Let's time travel to Venice, 1503, where we discover the first documented diamond engagement ring, belonging to one Mary of Modena. This marked the beginning of a tradition that has remained strong to this day. The Venetians were the first to unlock the diamond's enduring brilliance, making diamond rings a status symbol among the wealthy by the late 15th century. One of the earliest and smallest diamond engagement rings was for a 2-year-old bride-to-be, Princess Mary, daughter of Henry VIII. As a political alliance, she was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, who was also just an infant. The origin of betrothal rings in general is more mysterious, dating well before the 15th century. An early Anglo-Saxon custom had the groom breaking a valuable item, keeping half and giving the other to the bride's father. Eventually, this token was replaced by a ring. For Roman Catholics, Pope Nicholas I in 860 AD made engagement rings a mandatory statement of intent, starting a tradition. He also established the forfeiture of the ring if either party reneged on a marriage pledge, demonstrating the seriousness of a marriage promise. So, remember, the engagement ring carries not just a symbolic, but also a historical weight. The ring finger. Now let's explore why we wear our wedding rings on what we call the ring finger. The early Hebrews wore their rings on the index finger, while in India, it was worn on the thumb. However, the Western tradition of placing it on the 3rd finger, excluding the thumb, originated from a Greek medical misunderstanding in the 3rd century BC. Believing a vein, termed the vein of love, directly connected this finger to the heart, the Greeks deemed it the ideal digit for a symbol of love. The Romans, copying Greek anatomy charts, also adopted this practice, clarifying the 3rd finger as the finger next to the least, which doubled as their healing finger. Christians perpetuated this tradition, using a Trinitarian formula, where the groom moved the ring across the bride's hand, from the index to the middle, and finally to the ring finger, each move accompanied by a prayer. Interestingly, Eastern cultures didn't favor finger rings, viewing them as ornamental rather than symbolic. Quite a journey for our ring finger, isn't it? Marriage bands. During Europe's feudal times, bands were public announcements, but today we know them as pre-wedding declarations. This started with Charlemagne, who in AD 800, concerned about the genetic impact of sibling marriages, decreed all marriages be announced at least a week prior. This was to allow anyone aware of a blood relation between the future bride and groom to speak up. So next time you hear of marriage bands, remember, it's a practice rooted in medical concern and practicality, endorsed by all faiths due to its success. The wedding cake. Today's wedding cakes trace their roots back to ancient Rome, when they weren't eaten but thrown at brides as fertility symbols. Instead of sweet treats, brides faced a shower of wheat. Around 100 BC, Roman bakers started making sweet wheat cakes. These cakes were crumbled over the bride's head and then shared by the couple, symbolizing fertility and unity. The tradition evolved, and in England, the cake crumbs were washed down with a special ale, termed bride's ale. The classical multi-tiered cake we know today, however, originated in the 1660s by a French baker. Throwing shoes at the bride. Ever wondered why old shoes are tied to newlyweds' cars? This tradition originates from a time when shoes were thrown at brides as a symbol of fertility. From antiquity, the foot was seen as a potent phallic symbol. In certain cultures, women trying to conceive were advised to carry a piece of an old shoe. The preference for old shoes came down to economics. Shoes were never cheap. These traditions, alongside throwing rice or cake crumbs, all aimed at encouraging a fruitful marriage. Ironically, in today's era of family planning, our weddings are still filled with symbols of maximum fertility. The honeymoon. The term honeymoon wasn't always about post-wedding bliss. It originates from an Old Norse word, meaning hiding. In Northern Europe, a man would abduct a bride and hide her until her family stopped searching. As for the honeymoon, we know, the honey refers to the honeyed wine or mead newlyweds drank daily in their first month. The moon reflects a cynical twist. Northern Europeans used moon to symbolize the monthly cycle, suggesting marital sweetness may not last beyond the first month. The term honeymoon thus hints at a mix of abduction, mead drinking, and waxing waning marital affection. Wedding march. Ever wonder why we have two different tunes at weddings? It started with Princess Victoria's 1858 wedding. As the bride, she entered to Wagner's majestic bridal chorus from his 1848 opera, Lohengrin. Exiting as newlyweds, they strode to Mendelssohn's joyful Wedding March from his 1826 work, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Princess Victoria, a true arts patron, picked these pieces herself, and soon, brides across Britain followed suit, creating a cherished wedding tradition. So next time you're at a wedding, remember, you're listening to royal-inspired music. White wedding dress and veil. Did you know that the bridal veil predates the wedding dress by centuries, and the color of choice was yellow? Originating over 4,000 years ago in the East, veils were worn by unmarried women to show modesty and by married women to display submissiveness. As centuries passed, veil customs varied. Northern European countries used veils for abducted brides, while Greeks and Romans adopted sheer, yellow veils for weddings. The white wedding ensemble we know today first sparked debate in 16th century England and France. Originally symbolizing a bride's virginity, it faced backlash, with critics arguing that virginity shouldn't be advertised. However, by the late 18th century, white had become the standard for formal fashion. And in 1813, the first fashion plate of a white wedding gown and veil was published in the French journal Des Dames, solidifying white as the go-to wedding color. The divorce. Did you know that the earliest known marriage certificate was more of a bill of sale? It was found amongst Aramaic papyri from the 5th century BC, where 6 cows were exchanged for a 14-year-old girl. This document evolved under the Romans into a complex legal document, detailing dowry conditions and property division in case of divorce. Speaking of divorce, it began as a somewhat informal procedure. In early Athens and Rome, a husband could divorce his wife whenever love turned sour. Even in 7th century Anglo-Saxon society, men could divorce their wives for almost any reason. Researchers has found that in tribes where the mother's family heritage was valued, both partners agreeing to divorce was more common. In these tribes, the wife was often valued as the procreator and head of the household. In contrast, in tribes that valued the father's heritage more, bride wealth was more common. This was the symbolic process of giving the bride's rights to the husband. In these cultures, divorce usually favored the man's wishes. So there you have it. Marriage customs throughout time and their origins. Subscribe for more origin stories, and let us know in the comments what your favorite marriage custom is.